Hello, James. How do you like to pronounce your last name?
Hello, Michael. I pronounce my last name Delbourgo.
That's what I would have pronounced it like. Would you like me to take a guess or would you just like to tell me where it's from?
Why don't you guess?
I do want to guess. My first instinct is Portuguese, not Italian.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not correct, but it is a very good guess. And if you add the different elements together, you might end up with Portuguese. Um, I think we don't know for sure in the family, but the leading hypothesis is Spanish, Jewish, and then traveling through France, and then traveling through the to the four ends of the earth, and ending up in this instance in the United States.
Right. How much Jewish do you have in you currently?
I haven't checked lately, but the feeling is definitely Jewish.
Okay. Uh, I can't remember if I've had a Jew. I don't think I've had a Jewish guest from the UK. What has been your experience with anti-Semitism? Not in light of the current situation with Israel, but kind of a decade or more ago, let's say.
Well, I grew up in England, so and I should also add that my father was Jewish and my mother was not Jewish. So technically, therefore, we are not officially Jewish.
Right,
Um,
right, right.
but I would say that when I was in school in England in the 1980s, it was much more evident to my schoolmates that I was Italian and therefore foreign rather than Jewish and foreign. So that was really the experience that I had.
Was that helpful passing, as it were?
I don't think, Michael, they were seeking to help me.
Okay. Well, I guess we should probably leave it there. I want to just briefly mention that you are a professor of history at Rutgers. Is there something more we should add to that title currently?
No, I think that's
Because
sufficient.
science was mentioned at a certain point that I saw somewhere. Was that in the past?
I'm interested in many different things. So
Right,
I
right.
think if you want to call me a professor of history, it's a perfectly good description.
And are you working currently or recently with students as opposed to more of a research type position?
I have always taught a lot of students, undergraduates and graduate students throughout my career. So that remains the case, as well as, of course, researching and writing books.
Okay. So here's the inevitable question for a professor working with students these days. And based on some of the exchanges I've had in the past, you can certainly uh, plead the fifth or pass. But how do you feel about the hopes for our future vis-a-vis Gen Z, who you've been working with?
Oh, Michael, I don't really believe in any of that. I thought you were going to ask me about AI.
Okay, yeah, no, that would take too much time. Let's just talk about Gen Z.
I have no comment on Gen Z. Listen, all these labels are fairly ridiculous. If you're teaching young people, the question is, can you establish an intellectual relationship with them? That never changes. It's still the case. And
Mhm.
that's, I'm not going to talk about AI since you don't want to, but that would have been my answer.
Okay, got it. Yeah, no, in case you're curious or didn't pick it up, I am asking in the spirit of a number of people saying, I'm very hopeful because of these Gen Z kids and how open minded and compassionate and all those kinds of things. That was basically the angle that I was
Right,
alluding to. Yeah.
right. Okay.
Okay. All right. We'll leave it there. So, James, here is your book. We are finally getting to talk about it and collecting generally. And for people who are not on video, the title is A Noble Madness: The Dark Side of Collecting from Antiquity to Now. So, before we dive in officially to the book, I wanted to know to what extent you've been doing or have done a book tour for it.
I have been promoting the book in kind of the normal ways, not really a book tour. A few years ago, I did a very long book tour that seemed to last years. In fact, it seemed to just go on and on. I mean, maybe that was just in my mind, but no, it was a very long uh, intercontinental book tour. So I didn't do that this time around. But the book has been very well published and received, both in the US and in the UK. So it's gone very well. Thank you.
But you have you not done any like talks or what have you in New York or you know other
Not
obvious venues?
not that many this time around,
Yeah.
to be honest. So that makes me especially fresh as an interviewee for you, Michael.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It sounds like you got a little burnout on the last round, and so you're like, I'm not going through that again. Is that pretty much the
Well, I've been very
takeaway?
busy. I've been very busy with a number of other things, including a lot of administrative work at the university. So, there was that film La Double Vie de Véronique.
Yes.
I haven't been leading Veronique's life, but I've had two or three different uh, lives to deal with the last few years. So. Um, I think that the book has funded very well for itself.
Okay. Okay. It sounds exhausting, James. Whatever it is, whatever hoops and characters you've been playing, it sounds exhausting. I hope there's some rest now or in the near future.
On the contrary, it's been delightful.
Oh,
Long
good.
may it continue.
Okay. Okay. Good. Good. All right. Well, let's talk about collecting then, both through your book. Well, actually, you know what? Let me set up this question or our conversation about the book and collecting generally this way, which is that you're a professor of history, and yet prior to this book, you were writing a fair amount about contemporary art, including the artist Andrea Fraser, as well as the book about collecting, a book about hoarding, etc., which obviously came to be a chapter in this book. But I know we talked about this when we spoke before, but bring us up to speed on what led you to contemporary art and where you are in relation to contemporary art now, as far as like, do you feel like you will inevitably be writing about it or interested in it at some point in the future, or do you see it as more something in the past at this point?
Well, I suppose I have maybe, excuse me, a couple of different answers to that. One is, in a way, I was really never a very good historian because I was always interested in the present. Um, so that, early on when I was writing this book, I would go to galleries in Chelsea and downtown and that sort of thing, and just sort of see what was going on and how that was related to collecting in general. In general, I'm very bad at uh, leading just one life or following just one thread. And so, in a way, uh, even though my work was very much historical, um, I would go to galleries and, think, who's actually buying this kind of thing? Who are collectors now? What do they look like? Do they dress a certain way? Can you tell a collector? Do they have a certain manner about them? So I was interested in just thinking broadly and not only historically uh, about collectors. Indeed, I once met a collector who was extremely wealthy, who was a very intriguing individual, who gave me a lot of ideas about what collectors might be like in general, a certain passionate devotion or obsessive interest. And, some people can spend too much time in the archives and not realize that in fact, although things are very different from one period to the next, there are certain archetypes that, in fact, are true when it comes to a given phenomenon or figure, like the collector. So I found that there was a lot of resonance in the present for things that I'd read about in the past. And I was also essentially interested in not telling a specialized story. So I'm a general historian of science and collecting and museums and intellectual history and cultural history. I'm not an art historian, and I don't really believe in being too specialized because you actually get the story wrong, I think. So I was very interested in telling a big story over time that somehow had to be connected in the present. So I'm not really somebody who has a kind of lifelong interest in contemporary art, but in a way, what I was doing was taking contemporary art, collecting, and seeing it in a deep historical context.
Right, right. It sounds, pardon me, it sounds like you put on a bit of an anthropological hat when it came to collectors, perhaps.
Well, I think that's true in general, in that they are fascinating creatures. Um, and it is interesting to think about not simply what they buy, but how they live, how they hold themselves, what kind of entity a collector is, what kind of an acquisitive, um, calculating, but also driven, obsessive, passionate, uh, even irrational sort of
Yeah,
person. There's a lot of writing about that, as you know.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, as you're saying that, and what you were talking about before in terms of your trying to think through what a collector looks like, what they talk like, or what have you. I couldn't help but think that contemporary art collectors are a certain type. Other collectors who you profile in the book, including living ones as opposed to ones from antiquity, are a different type. But I mean, just for the context of this podcast or this show, um, I mean, certainly we can say that when we are in a contemporary gallery, certainly a blue chip gallery, uh, it's pretty easy to recognize collectors in those contexts because they are being treated a certain way. They're usually positioned near the back room, if not already in it, right, where we can't see them. But apart from that, I mean, what were some of your takeaways as a putting on your anthropological hat or just your research hat?
Well, it's important to have a lot of hats,
And you do clearly.
especially if you live in New York, where the weather is schizophrenic as always. You need as many hats as possible. You know, it's from my point of view, as somebody who's not really part of the art world, it's fascinating how self-evident your definition of what a collector looks like. They're the powerful blue chip person who's probably invisible, that most of us aren't going to see. I think this is one of the things that fascinated me about uh, just that word, collector. It can suggest a very powerful person, or it can suggest equally a very weak person, or a very nondescript person. For example, if we were to step back into the 20th century, I guess really before the rise of uh, extraordinarily lucrative and expensive recent contemporary art collecting, that word collector probably resonated in a way that described somebody who was retiring, shy, on the surface normal, but who might, in fact, underneath that, be somebody who was deranged, dangerous, a danger to themselves, a danger to other people. Probably the most famous use of this idea was in the 1960s in John Fowles' novel *The Collector*, that was made into a film directed by William Wyler, starring Terence Stamp and Samantha Eggar. That's a film about a butterfly collector who is deranged and kidnaps or collects a young woman. And this was, I think, in part because of the legacy of Freudian psychoanalysis, which at the end of the 19th century started to ask this question: why exactly do we collect? What does it mean to do so? So, just to connect that to what you said about the contemporary art market, there's an extraordinarily it's not an arc so much as a corkscrew, how the profile of the collector has been changed, I think, in the last 100 years. A lot of it, of course, is to do with money. And the power of money makes the idea of the collector seem like a more powerful figure now. But if we were to go back to the Freudian 20th century, that word collector would be synonymous with repression, psychic trouble, and danger.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, I'm glad you brought up The Collector, and certainly we should talk more about that and Psycho, which you dive into in a very interesting way right alongside that book and movie. I do want to briefly, I don't know if it was a Freudian slip, speaking of Freud, but you did say,
Probably.
I want to call you out on saying um, the collectors being invisible. Is that I caught you saying at one point? I don't know if that's what you intended or what you meant, but I mean, it's for me, it's the opposite, at least in a gallery
Oh, I
situation.
see what you're saying.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
okay,
yeah,
sure, sure.
yeah. Okay,
No, I said that really thinking of two examples that
yeah,
Andy Warhol liked to send people to buy at auctions for him.
right,
And when Salvator Mundi, the long lost Leonardo da Vinci painting a few years ago, was bought by a collector in the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, I think it was, for $450 million. At the time, nobody knew who bought it.
right,
So
right.
that's maybe at yet another level from the one you were talking about.
Right. And I do want to make one more tangent before we finally get into the book and starting with these films and books. And that is that you briefly alluded to the experience of visiting with a collector. Now, I'm not sure if the collector you're referring to is the same one that I have to in the most cryptic way share about here, because when we spoke before, I had the pleasure of hearing about a visit you had with a collector who we can leave completely vague, as I imagine per your wishes. But the takeaway that I had that I so appreciated was the degree to which you experience that level of power, right? Through money, through confidence, etc., as a visitor in that case. So I just wanted to throw that out there now in case it comes up later, or just get it out of the way, etc.
Okay, good.
No comment. Okay.
What do you want me to say?
Well, I guess you could clarify if when you were referring to the collector a little while ago, if that's the same one or if it's another collector that you're referring to.
Oh, sure. So let's say it's the same one. So yeah, collectors. I guess the figures I was mentioning were
Yeah.
you know people whose power does reside in their um, invisibility in certain ways when it comes to the actual act of collecting, and that I suppose what we're talking about is the corkscrew of status and distinction making and differentiation. Is it an elite thing to do to be a brash, visible collector, or is it a vulgar thing to do that a true collector eschews because the ultimate form of power is invisibility. So it's an interesting question in terms of cultural mentality, economic position, social status, as to how that question plays out.
Did you come up with the corkscrew metaphor, or was that already out there? Because that's a good one.
You know,
I just want
Michael,
to give you props for that.
I use corkscrews all the time when it comes to opening fine bottles of wine. I favor the corkscrew.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Well said. Um, okay. Well, I have a lot that we could talk about. First of all, I mean, for people listening, just to, not to sort of tease people for too long, you really do talk a lot about, I think, a heart of the sort of modern section of the book, as opposed to the antiquity section of the book, does get into certain parts of pop culture vis-a-vis collecting. And interestingly, and for I think listeners, including myself, surprisingly, you talk a lot about Psycho. And one of the things that you talk about regarding Psycho is the original book that the movie was based on, in which the Norman Bates character is, in fact, as opposed to the very charming, uh, you know, even sort of the character that's sort of hard to maybe paint as an anti-hero because he's so charming, Anthony Perkins is, as opposed to that character, the Norman Bates in the Robert Bloch Pulp Fiction classic, as you call it, from 1959, is this I don't know if nebbishy is the right word, that for some reason that came up, but this perhaps, well, as you put it, because I have it here, pacey and punchy. Oh no, I'm sorry. Forgive me. That is what you called the book. Let's see. Well, I'll let you describe the character in the book, but all to say that you were talking about more of a reserved, or even kind of receding and weak. That's the word I was looking for. You were talking about a
Yes.
weak individual. So I guess all to ask. So Norman Bates in the book is sort of the quintessential weak collector.
Yes. The word for Norman Bates in Robert Bloch's 1959 novel Psycho is ugly. He's ugly. He's bespectacled. He is fat. He is not prepossessing. So he, in that sense, represents the collector as an ugly loser and a nobody. You can go right back to the 19th century. You can go back to Balzac's 1840s novel Cousin Pons, about a Paris collector of old masters, Sylvain Pons. And Pons is unprepossessing. The whole point that Balzac made, really half a century before Freud, was that this is a loser at life. He's intelligent, his career hasn't gone well, romantically, he's a failure, but he's a great collector. He knows how to spot a great work of art and buy it for very little money. So, as Balzac writes, the collection is his consolation, and he describes it as sa maîtresse. It's his mistress. It's his romantic consolation. Essentially, Freud, around 1900, will say the same thing, but in a rather more elaborate psychoanalytical way that, according to Freud, really not citing Balzac explicitly, but using this idea, collecting is another way to pursue love when love with other people doesn't work. Objects will love us back. So if you jump forward another half century to Robert Bloch writing Psycho, Bloch is immersed in what by then is the unavoidable popular influence of Freudian psychoanalysis. Many Hitchcock films, of course, show this very clearly. The most obvious example is Spellbound with Ingrid Bergman and Gregory Peck. But a lot of Hitchcock films are essentially explorations of Freudian problems. And Psycho is a perfect expression of this idea, because the very first time we experience the character of Norman Bates, he is sitting in his parlor with Janet Leigh, who plays Marion Crane, who was stolen a lot of money, stopped at the Bates Motel. They have dinner, and they have dinner in a parlor where Norman Bates is surrounded by stuffed birds, a whole collection, including dioramas, of meticulously stuffed animals arranged very carefully in a kind of static private world. That, if you like, is the first image of Norman Bates that Hitchcock slips in, and in later interviews where famously Hitchcock discussed over many hours, a bit like we're doing today, although for much longer, with Francois Truffaut. Hitchcock said the birds were intended to be a kind of psychoanalytical clue that all was not as it appeared with Norman Bates. The final thing to say there, of course, is that initially Norman Bates looks for all the world like a completely dominated man, completely dominated by his mother. And so there's such an intense attention there to the apparent psychological and emotional weakness of this character who is trapped in this relationship, but who, of course, turns out to be the aggressor. And that, it seems to me, is one of the ongoing themes in the presentation of the collector over the arc of modern cultural history. There's a very clear predecessor for this that I will mention just briefly, and that is, of course, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray in the 1890s, where Dorian Gray, in some ways, is a precursor of that figure, an aesthete, an art lover who becomes a connoisseur, part of a very refined world, but within Dorian Gray lurks a kind of mortal, psychotic, homicidal potential. So Dorian Gray and Norman Bates look like completely different characters, of course. They certainly have completely different class positions, completely different educational background, and so on. And yet it's a very interesting link that they have, this image of the collector as so refined as to be really beyond normal, ordinary interactions, but in fact, potentially so tormented within that they pose a danger either to themselves or to other people that other people can't see in them.
Hmm. Hmm. By the way, this is going to feel a little trivial, but I can't help but bring it up since you wrote about it as part of your analysis of the film, the Hitchcock take on Psycho, which was that in addition to the taxidermy birds on the wall, it's Marion Crane, right?
Indeed.
And in fact,
Yes.
as you argue or state, um, it's even more sort of give this sense that Norm Bates is the hunter and Crane is the hunted.
Yes, that was all changed for the film. So you're right to bring it up, because originally in the Bloch novel, Norman Bates is a fat, ugly man who stuffs squirrels.
Okay.
It really was a transformation, the casting of Anthony Perkins, because it made, I think, a squalid pulp fiction villain into a handsome, charming, uh, elegant, respectable, thoroughly ingratiating kind of figure who therefore positions the audience on his side. That, I think, was really a stroke of genius. So it took something in the novel Psycho that was kind of squalid and ugly, and put it in a form where the audience had to fall in with Norman Bates, which is not to say that the original Norman Bates, as Robert Bloch wrote him, was not a very interesting character. He certainly was. You know, we see, for example, or we learn in the book that he reads deeply into anthropology. He reads about the lives of savages. He reads about human sacrifice, and so there is an intellectual background to Norman Bates that comes through the novel that is different from the film. And it's also worth pointing out very briefly that he believes in the book that actually his taxidermy, his preservation of his mother's corpse, is actually a form of magic, that she is literally back to life, not merely, as it were, as a result of his schizophrenia. So, interestingly, in the novel, Norman Bates is not a prepossessing character, but he's also not a very modern character. He believes in magic, and he believes that to collect and assemble body parts literally does bring somebody back to life. And this is essentially all purged in the film, where we have a very handsome protagonist who is essentially positioned as a kind of psychoanalytic or psychological case study. The anthropology is completely edited out.
Mm. There's a through line that you expressed or alluded to in talking about the Bloch or Bates era collector and then going back to Balzac. And I'm not going to be able to nail the exact tone, but the gist of it was that the collector weakling or ugly, as you the word you used earlier, it was the collector who was unable to have romantic relationships either because of their ugliness, their nebbishness, to use that word again, etc. Um, and I couldn't help but think, okay, so if that was the circa turn of the 20th century model and then circa mid-century model,
Mm.
is not today, I mean, this is not a collector model, but is that not sort of the precursor to the incel type?
Well, how do you sound like you have made a connection between incels and collectors?
In this case, apparently I have, but
I
we're
mean,
talking
are there
about
documented cases?
uh okay, well, maybe why don't we frame it this way? The way that you were describing
Yes.
Norman Bates,
Yes.
and it sounded like in regard to characters of the Balzac era, if I remember right, um, was a guy.
Mm.
I seem to have the sense that it's a male character, not a female one,
Right.
who is, in addition to sort of having this interaction with stuff, right? Because
Yeah.
that's where they have power and control. They don't have any control over their romantic lives or their, potential romantic lives. That was the through line that I was trying to draw. Is that one that
I,
you
I
can
I
see?
see. I see what you're
Yeah.
saying.
Yeah.
It's not the way I would describe it. I would mention a couple of things, however, that I think come more out of the history itself. One is the history of same sex love. Of course, Oscar Wilde uh, was homosexual, and there are readings of the picture of Dorian Gray that point out essentially that some of the earlier drafts before the most famous later reprinted edition has more explicit language about same sex love between Dorian Gray and the artist Basil Hallward, who paints him. So there's an argument with great credibility that the story of Dorian Gray and the torment that Dorian Gray experiences is related, to some extent to the troubles that Oscar Wilde experienced in his own biography. I wouldn't want to reduce uh, uh, what is a very multi-level supernatural gothic horror story to that one biographical fact, but it's clearly relevant. And of course, Norman Bates could be seen, depending on what language we want to use, as either partly a camp figure or a queer figure. When Susan Sontag, for example, is writing about collecting later on, I think this is in the 1960s, she wrote an essay about camp style in collecting, emphasizing a certain eclecticism, a certain riotous variety of juxtaposing many different kinds of things as a kind of, well, her word was a camp style. Maybe people today would say queer style
Yeah.
more readily. So there is a genealogy there of a position of a male collector who may well be somebody who is part of this, on the one hand, a kind of troubled history or socially troubled history of same sex relationships and repressed desires. This certainly came, it was also an idea, of course, in Freudian psychoanalysis. On the other hand, and I think complementary to that, not intrinsic and not unique to such men, was the idea that was talked about by Oscar Wilde, actually, in the late 19th century, and many others, that surrounding oneself with beautiful things coming out of the late Victorian era into the early 20th century was a form of spiritual, offered a form of spiritual healing. That it was what was known as the House Beautiful movement, and the many wealthy people who filled their homes with many different kinds of beautiful decorative arts, as well as art and sculpture, and who made very beautiful house museums for themselves. This, in a sense, was uh, partly a result of a belief in the idea that beautiful things were good for the soul, and that collecting was therefore kind of the highest aesthetic and spiritual life that one could lead. And there were many women who were part of that. We're talking about the era of Gertrude Stein, but I'm thinking of other collectors, as she was, of modern art and of decorative arts, like Mabel Dodge Luhan, who was from Buffalo, New York, who spent a lot of time in Italy, ended up in the Taos art colony in New Mexico. And Mabel Dodge is a very interesting example because she's very much part of that late Victorian house beautiful movement, but ultimately is somebody who reads Freud, engages very heavily with psychoanalysis, and comes to regard all of these beautiful trappings not as the liberation of the soul, but as a gilded cage. So within that range of personal and cultural factors, I think we have a picture of the different currents that animated an idea that to be a collector of beautiful things and to surround yourself with beauty was the part of the pursuit of one's self-realization, which then people came to question, I think, in no small part through psychoanalytic introspection.
This is a bit of a just a little aside, but I can't help but wonder, as you were describing the beautiful collections, house beautiful movement you mentioned in particular, to what extent through your book research process did you get to go to some of these locations, and to what extent, in retrospect now, you feel like getting to see some of these things, whether it be, the house beautiful or more contemporary collections, to what extent that is in, key to your research, or if it's just kind of like more of a side benefit.
That is a very good question. I actually believe it's very central. And before you asked me about these collectors, well, I didn't meet that many of them, and they did have an impact on me. I think actually going to some of these houses was much more important for my thinking and for my imagination. I suppose, in a way, it's the old situation of if you have a house in a collection. I was sort of reproducing the argument in my book. If you have a house in a collection, you start to want to deduce what sort of person made this place.
Yeah.
What kind of fingerprint is this? What smell in terms of who am I detecting? Whose presence animated this place? I think that was more inspiring because it was more open and more suggestive. And there are two examples I can give of houses that I visited that were very rewarding and very suggestive. One is Hurst Castle in just near San Luis Obispo in
San
San
Simeon.
Simeon.
Yep.
Exactly. William Randolph Hearst, the inspiration for Orson Welles, who did not think very highly of William Randolph Hearst. I think Hearst tried to sue him after he thought that Citizen Kane was a kind of libelous assault on everything that Hearst stood for. Of course, Hearst was a newspaper tycoon and a great collector. But if you remember the image in the famous image in Citizen Kane, is that Kane, when he becomes rich and wealthy in the film, and he actually is born, he's adopted, and he's from an early age wealthy. Before he becomes a great newspaper grandee, he goes on a grand tour of Europe. He buys so much art, he never even opens the crates. That was the kind of image of acquisitive futility that Orson Welles wanted to torment Hearst with, and he did, even though he got Hearst wrong. In the end of that film, Hearst, Kane, famously dies alone, and the newspaper reporters look at his collection and they say, "Well, can we figure out what the key to his life was based on the art he bought?" And that is the gambit of the film. And from Wells's point of view, he was trying to say that this was all empty, soulless acquisition. It was an early dig at art collecting as soulless. It's just money. These people are gloomy depressives, which in fact in real life William Randolph Hearst was not. And Hearst Castle was very social. He had guests all the time: Cary Grant, Charlie Chaplin. I mean, it was a constant turnover, and he ran his newspaper empire from there. So going there, given its remoteness, and given, I suppose what struck me about Hearst Castle was the fact that a couple of things. That if I'm remembering correctly, Hearst delegated a lot of his collecting to a woman who worked for him, whose name escapes me, who was essentially very involved in acquisition. That's part of it. The other part was that, in a sense, that collecting was not so much because a given work of art was incredibly valuable to them. Instead, it was, how do we create a nicely aesthetically coherent space and match things together? In other words, it was a form of collecting that was at a bit of a remove, not that personal, and really to do with a kind of social stage management to create an environment to receive guests. I mean, that actually just, in a way, detonated all of the cliches about Hearst that Welles had tried to project through Citizen Kane, that he was a recluse, that he was depressed, gloomy, isolated, that sort of gothic image of the collector as somebody who withdraws from society, turns in on themselves, and just kind of rots in the tomb of their own treasures, like some sort of modern pharaoh. In the film, it's called Xanadu, after all. So that was a very interesting experience. The other one,
Before you
yeah,
go to
go
the
ahead.
next one, James, before you leave Hearst, I wanted to
Yeah.
ask a question and then would just make a very brief comment, which is that um, I've been to Hearst Castle twice. Once when I was a kid, and I did. I think we did the full tour with my family when I was a kid, and in the immense dining room, with the dining table, for like 30 people or whatever, on the table there was a bottle of Heinz ketchup, I believe. So I just wanted to mention that. But my question,
Can I mention
yeah,
something
yeah, yeah,
about the dinner
please,
table?
please, yeah,
The story I was told on our tour, which I take to be true, is that guests would stay for several days, and when they arrived, they might be in favor, and they might be of a special interest to Mr. Hurst, so they would be seated right next to him at dinner. But sometimes he might tire of certain people. So, Michael, if you or I said the wrong thing or we were boring, the next day at dinner we might be sat at the far end from the great man. And that was the way they ran the dinner places.
that James, that is such an important observation, because what you really hit on is you're talking about the version of a collector, and maybe this is far too universal to apply just to a collector, but the one who needs to be entertained at absolute top level, and if they are disappointed, you're gone.
Well, I think there is something to that in the sense of the collector as the puppeteer, the orchestrator, who has enough wealth because they're the great collector to not only collect things but in a sense orchestrate people as
Right,
part of their collection.
right, right. Yeah, exactly. So the other thing that I wanted to mention before you give your other example about uh, Citizen Kane and Orson Welles' take on Hearst, allegedly, is you mentioned the crates of artworks unopened. Was Wells incredibly prescient or just lucky in inevitably referring to the high end tombs of storage facilities that have become uh, so filled with expensive artworks these days?
Well, that's a good point. Maybe he was a little prescient. He. What I can say is that in interviews after the film came out, he essentially rejected the Freudian, the viability of the Freudian idea. Not so much Freud himself, but his followers. They were very keen on the idea that you could look at a collection as a set of clues as to the inner life of the individual. They didn't just tell you about taste or about personality. They told you deeper, darker things about troubles, childhood, trauma. Wells thought this was funny. He thought it was a truism, a shibboleth, just an endlessly repeated, shallow hack piece of biographical interpretation. And he, in a way, he showcases that in the film, because in the film you have that prescient image of this vast storehouse of things that never gets opened and then is either carted off or burned at the end of the film. And that's Orson Welles sort of thumbing his nose at Freudian psychoanalysis, saying, no, you can't decode a man's or a person's life based on uh, purely what they owned. For Wells, according to what he said, the idea was essentially a much more social economic critique of economic excess. So in fact, I think he was speaking the language that you were just speaking. It was in a way looking forward to pure meaningless excess. You're that wealthy, you buy meaninglessly more than you can possibly appreciate.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, you want to get to your other example?
Absolutely. So now we go to Italy, to northern Italy, to Lake Garda, And just north of Lake Garda, in the town of Gardone, well worth a visit, you will find a very special villa called the Vittoriale degli Italiani. This was a villa that was owned by Gabriele D'Annunzio, who was an Italian poet, provocateur, journalist, politician, pilot. He was everything in a way. He was one of those classic early 20th century modernist figures who, in some ways, was a precursor to Mussolini, although he disliked Mussolini and didn't trust Mussolini, and died. Gabriele D'Annunzio died essentially before fascism really took hold in Italy especially in the 20s and 30s. But D'Annunzio was a very strong nationalist, but he was also a kind of classic modernist visionary poet. So his house, the Vittoriale, is filled with all kinds of objects, and it's completely stuffed. Again, it's a fascinating case of a collector as somebody, I think, whose intelligence wants to sit behind and orchestrate, as we just said with Hirst. For example, at the entranceway to the villa, before you go in and see all the books and see all the decorative arts and see all the artifacts and see things like a head of a horse from the Elgin marbles, a copy that actually D'Annunzio himself apparently used tea to make it look aged and authentic. That was actually done to this cast of one of the horse heads of the Parthenon marbles. But before you even got inside, there was a little stairway, and at the top of the stairway, there were two doors, two ways in. One way in was the way in for the people D'Annunzio regarded as friends. The other way in was a door for people he didn't regard as friends. In other words, again, this is that era, the late 19th, the early 20th century. This is the House Beautiful movement. These are, whatever we make of their politics, extraordinary individuals, wealthy, talented, ambitious, inspired by the extraordinary changes of their times, technology, the extraordinary intensity and danger of those times. They're not simply putting beautiful houses together to improve themselves, as it were, spiritually or aesthetically. They are trying to realize a sort of commanding form of life in which the people who enter that house become part of the collection and can be moved around the house in different ways. So in a way, that's quite similar to Hirst, even though I think D'Annunzio was a very, very different sort of person. But going to that house, I think, was extraordinary for the following reason. Because of his associations with fascism as a kind of pre-fascist nationalist, D'Annunzio has a very checkered reputation in Italy. He also wrote very melodramatic novels with titles like Il piacere, pleasure. And he was one of the, if you like, one of the great decadent novelists writing in the 1880s, 90s, same time as Oscar Wilde, same time as J.K. Huysmans in Paris. So he's part of that era. And you go to the house and you expect the experience to be, well, how can I put this? You have a kind of an image in your mind of how the collections may affect you based on what you know about him. But when you enter the house, it has extraordinary charisma. The views of the lake are extraordinary. It has very strange things. For example, outside on the grounds, there is a small prow of a military ship that D'Annunzio actually collected and incorporated as part of the hillside. So there's a surreal element to it. But beyond all of those elements, it has a grandeur and a charisma and an interest that I think to some extent transcend the checkered nature of the biography. So that was a remarkable experience. I think perhaps more intense than Hearst Castle, given that D'Annunzio is a more charged figure. But it's a wonderful place to visit because I think your reactions to it are not straightforward. They're not just one reaction. I think you have many reactions, and in a sense, therefore, that's a real collection. That's a living collection. You can't go there and say, this is just a fascist collection or a fascist. That's the interesting thing about it.
I can't help but wonder whether when you get to go in through the two separate entrances, right? And does one is one superior to the other?
I think you'd have to go, Michael. Let's all go back and check for ourselves because I can't remember.
Okay.
It was some years ago.
Okay.
That's a very that's an interesting detail. I think the point is that he was like Hearst, somebody who was not just a collector but an orchestrator.
I can't help but wonder when you go into just, colleagues or whomever, friends' homes, whether in New York City or elsewhere, whether you, to what degree you bring your uh, historian, but more like sort of now collector conscious hat into the room. You know what I mean? I mean, I think as artists, I think myself as an artist, I think I do it inevitably. Like, okay, let's see what we got on the walls here, or or sculptures or what have you. Uh, and whether the home falls somewhere closer to the college dorm room end of the spectrum, right, or to the ambitious, collecting with what limited means we have kind of end of the spectrum. You know what I mean? It's just a question that occurred to me as you were talking about, particularly the Italian home that you visited.
Well, I suppose what I've learned is that whether it's deliberate or accidental, intended or, in a sense, just a phenomena, a byproduct of the way people arrange things, no matter what the degree of intentionality, an effect is created. And so, therefore, you may as well pay attention both to the effect and its production, because essentially things perform in space. It can be very carefully orchestrated, it can be carelessly incidental, but that encounter with a person's place, with their things, it doesn't merely create an impression, I think. It is a physical experience that constitutes the way you understand this person and indeed your relationship to them. That space, those things put you in a certain kind of relationship to that person. Freud, in his original psychoanalytical medical practice in Vienna, had many of his classical sculptures, many figurines, many statues, paintings around his place of psychoanalytic care, so that the people who came to engage in psychoanalysis would see them, would be aware of them, and would have the opportunity in some ways to react to them. We don't know, I think, in great detail, but we do know, for example, that the poet H.D., Hilda Doolittle, wrote about the fact that as an educated person herself, as somebody versed in the history of classical civilization, these objects were meaningful to her. There was a shared frame of reference, and they were to her a kind of an offer or a challenge or a gambit on Freud's part. I think our impression is that he didn't quiz or directly engage people about them. Of course, that was not the Freudian way of proceeding. The Freudian way of proceeding was one in which the truth is elicited obliquely, not directly. The Freudian slip. Truth comes out accidentally when the psychic defenses of the individual are not up and on guard. So these objects that to some extent populated the space of psychoanalysis in those early years, of course, when this was a rather elite clientele
Mm.
with a shared educational background and a shared set of cultural references. That's a particular example of the way in which the presence of those objects for some of those patients did constitute the experience of what it meant to be psychoanalyzed and what it meant to actually be in conversation with Sigmund Freud. So it's not that every single of my friends or colleagues' apartments are set up like that, but nevertheless, I have come to appreciate that how we orchestrate the physical contents of our places of meeting always constitutes in part the quality of the meeting. Do you not find that as well?
I mean, yeah, it's an interesting point. I think what I was thinking just before you finished your point is that I think when I go into a space, ideally I am set at ease, right, by whatever configuration is going on. Obviously, the hosting, is crucial as well. But generally, I think I'm either set at ease or on one end of the spectrum, I'm really intrigued by maybe some of the work in the home, or on the other end, want to get the hell out of there, right?
Yes.
Yes. So,
Deeply
I mean,
disturbed. You
yeah.
realize that coming was a big mistake.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think it's hard to follow up with any of that. I was going to say, well, it sounds like you're implicitly, but now I think we're kind of explicitly supporting the Freudian take on the way that one puts together their home. Are we not?
Well, I wouldn't. Well, I wouldn't say there are no accidents, which
Right.
became a kind of Freudian truism. That I would not say. There's plenty of accidents,
Okay.
but those accidents of space, of display, also constitute relations between people. They will, if you leave something out that you don't want to leave out, that somebody then sees, it doesn't mean, I would say, that it is a Freudian slip, but that element of contingency can indeed color an impression, change a relationship. So the standard with Freud is everybody says, "Oh, it's all ridiculous and overdone and offensive," but we all still think, not in the details, but we can reject the details because our entire culture learned the language, learned the way of looking, and never unlearned it.